Few American combat formations in 1944 were sent into a more punishing blind fight than the U.S. troops ordered into the Vosges mountains of eastern France at the end of October. For the first time in the European War, the U.S. Army had to break a German fixed defense inside deep woods and fog-poured ravines without armor or air as a guarantee. The Vosges were not alpine snow peaks. They were worse for infantry. Low, wooded verticals of wet rock and evergreen that made dead ground infinite and ambush elementary. In the closing days of October, the 36th Infantry Division, the Texas division that had taken Salerno and lost at the Rapido, pushed east toward the German frontier. German resistance stiffened as the 14 SS Corps used the terrain itself as an amplifier. Machine guns were positioned not for mass fire, but for silent disappearance of small American patrols. By the time the push crested into the timber of the Bifontaine sector, regimental staffs were already writing in their logs that maps were losing utility by the hour. The mission that emerged on paper sounded routine: push the line forward to open a gateway through the Vosges for a broader Allied roll toward the Rhine. But field officers understood the unprinted task: isolate, locate, and, if still alive, recover a U.S. infantry battalion that had advanced, lost lateral contact, and then vanished in the woods. In an army that measured everything, a missing battalion was a wound to credibility as much as to combat power. That burden fell not on fresh units but on the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, Nisei soldiers from Hawaii and the mainland, many with their parents still held in U.S. internment camps. Their record in Italy already read like proof under fire. Commanders deployed them not to test them but because they closed missions that other formations could not close. Trucks dropped them short of the timberline. The last 100 yards were on foot, under dripping pine boughs that suffocated sight and sound. The pain registered fast and without spectacle. Movement off a logging trace meant disappearing into a saturated green-black where even flares died in canopy. Radios fought water, range, and terrain shadow. Platoons that scouted by compass vanished into folds of forest and had to be refound by whistle at arm's length. German forward security detachments fired at throat height, then faded before U.S. squads could wheel to flank. "The woods eat men," one officer wrote in a pocket diary, "and return only noise." The insight that hardened inside these first hours was not romantic. Terrain is a combatant. The enemy merely rides it. In a marginal note to a situation report, a Battalion S3 penned the line, "We do not rescue for glory, we rescue so the Army's word means something." To cold readers in 2025 this may sound abstract, but in a citizen army, men pulled from towns, not castes, the currency of the promise was the cohesion of the force. Modern ears can hear in that note a managerial truth that outlives the war. Institutions do not survive on slogans, they survive when the rank and file see that promises cost the top something. The Vosges commitment, to send a high-performing regiment to cut back into a killing forest for a unit that might already be gone, was an act of strategic self-preservation as much as rescue. By the time forward scouts tapped the first cut traces near Bifontaine, the operational picture was paradoxically darker. There was no reliable proof the surrounded Americans were alive. There was only the obligation to act as though they were. The woods offered no insight, only more intake of men and time. And every hour the ring closed tighter around whomever remained to be found ahead of the line. By the dawn of October 26, 1944, a silence had settled over the ridge above the French village of Bifontaine that was more unnerving than shellfire. Somewhere beyond that fog lay the lost battalion, the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment, 36th Division, cut off from friendly lines for nearly a week. They had pushed forward in a textbook advance and, through no fault of their own, been swallowed by the forest and the German 338th Volksgrenadier Division's counter-encirclement. No radio messages had come back since the 25th. Their location was a matter of grid squares and hope. When headquarters realized that 2 rescue attempts had already failed, the order came through. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team would break through, no matter the cost. "No fallback authorized," read the typed directive. Officers of the 442nd knew what that meant. They were to succeed or be annihilated trying. The Nisei soldiers, many of whom had parents behind barbed wire in the U.S., took the order without outward complaint. But among themselves, They understood that this mission would define how their loyalty would be remembered, if at all. The approach was brutal and slow. Rain turned the clay trails into glue. Supply jeeps sank axle-deep before reaching the front. German artillery zeroed in on every movement, guided by forward observers in the pine ridges above. The shelling never stopped, remembered Staff Sergeant George Sakato. We could not tell if we were advancing 10 yards or none at all. Even the medics began to run low on morphine and bandages, improvising field dressings from shirts. The mud, the cold, and the uncertainty combined to grind down morale faster than the enemy could. Inside the pocket, the 211 men of the Lost Battalion were living off fragments of rations and rainwater caught in helmets. Lieutenant Harold Tex West wrote his final note in a tattered field book. "We are surrounded. Germans calling on us to surrender. No answer from command. We will hold. God help the boys trying to find us." 4 days, they repelled attack after attack, often by platoons of German infantry who shouted taunts from the woods, promising safe passage that never came. The 442 ND's assault began on the morning of October 27th. 2 companies went in abreast, moving up a slope code-named Bonsai Hill, a bitter nickname chosen later for its futility. Mortars and snipers slashed through the trees. "You didn't see the enemy," remembered one rifleman. "You just fired at sound and flash." Squad leaders used ropes tied to their belts to keep their men connected in the fog. Those who fell were often unrecoverable until the fighting shifted hours later. The officers tried to keep order in chaos. Captain John Hanley scrawled in his notebook that morning, "The Germans are invisible and patient. They wait for us to break cover, then vanish. This is not war in any textbook. It's pursuit by sound." Later, when those notes surfaced in archives, historians found them less a tactical observation than a glimpse into the psychological attrition of the forest itself, an enemy of silence and exhaustion. From a command tent far behind the line, higher headquarters watched the situation deteriorate. They could not risk artillery support without hitting the Lost Battalion. They could not send tanks through terrain that ate steel and traction. So the 442nd pressed forward with rifles, grenades, and sheer will. The pain was personal now. Every hill taken revealed only another ridge beyond, another set of machine gun nests, and another page in the growing casualty list. Yet the Nisei soldiers refused to stop. "We would not let the word lost become permanent," said Private Hiroshi Miyamura years later. As night fell on October 28th, scattered companies dug shallow foxholes under dripping pines. They were closer, maybe a mile or less, but no one could prove it. Runners returned with conflicting reports. One claimed to have heard distant American voices through the fog, another insisted it was an ambush. Commanders decided, at dawn, they would push again. That night, the forest was silent but alive with tension, unseen movement, whispered code words, and the constant expectation of the next mortar. Somewhere beyond that darkness, 211 men still waited, running out of food and time. Between them stood a forest that devoured compasses, erased direction, and tested every promise an army could make. By the morning of October 29th, the character of the fight had shifted from attack to attrition. Platoons went forward not in clean lines but in thin, nervous threads, men spaced like shadows, feeling their way by touch and interval rather than sight. The Vosges forest closed like a lid. Even the sound of boots was eaten by wet needles. Visibility was down to feet, not yards. This was no longer maneuver, it was collision in the dark. Patrols pushed off without lights, moving on compass and memory of yesterday's tree lines. More than once, forward scouts stepped into German strongpoints at 10 paces, traded a handful of rifle shots, then vanished back into timber. "Our maps died," wrote one company executive officer. "We were navigating by wounds and noise. Any idea of frontage, of flanks, of doctrinal geometry, dissolved. The battle became tactile. You knew where the enemy was when metal or men hit something. Equipment failure became an enemy of its own. Radio tubes cracked in cold and rain. Wire teams could not lay line across ravines without losing men. Helmets collected water heavy as bricks. Rifles slick with pine gum and clay misfed unless wiped constantly. Even the medics, normally exempt from detail, were drafted into carrying litters through mud that swallowed ankles and balance. What artillery support the division owned could not fire blind without risking the very battalion they aimed to save. The worst feature was not fire but disappearance. Squads sent to scout a lateral draw simply did not return by the hour they were due. Sometimes they trickled back in halves, without NCOs. Other times they did not come back at all. "The forest eats patrols," one lieutenant wrote that night. "A party slips off a trail by 10 feet and becomes a statistic, not a sound." In the regiment's journal, a chilling administrative note appeared: "Do not assume absence equals desertion." It was a clerical admission that erasure, not flight, explained the missing. Small unit diaries show the mental toll in plain handwriting. A sergeant wrote on a ration box panel, "We are hunting our own people like lost children." Another scrawled a cold truth: "You don't know if you're 400 yards from friends or 4 miles." In after-action interviews decades later, veterans still remembered the feeling that terrain, not ideology, was the core antagonist. The SS and Volksgrenadiers merely exploited what the woods already enforced: formlessness and fear. Modern ears often imagine World War II as a contest of steel and production curves, but the Vosges remind the living that context crushes capital. A million shells and tanks mean nothing in woods that won't permit them. The lesson, that the medium governs what outcomes are even possible, reverberates far beyond war. In business, in policy, in any human plan, a bad medium punishes good intentions without explanation. By dusk on the 29th, no one at the 442nd Command Post could certify how much ground had been gained. Runners brought in more wounded than news. No one could say with confidence whether the lost battalion was alive, surrounded, overrun, or already gone. The forest had yielded nothing. No prisoners, no papers, no intercepted signals, no human proof. Only the arithmetic of casualties suggested the Americans were pointed in roughly the right direction, because resistance thickened as they bled. Night fell with that unresolved dread, pressing now as weight rather than rumor. Somewhere ahead, the missing Texans might still be holding a pocket in the dark. Or the Americans were driving blind toward a silence that meant they were already too late. The turn came at the end of October, not with clarity but with a decision that there was no daylight left to bargain with. On October 30th to 31st, the 442nd was ordered to make a straight break of the German ring encasing the Texans. No more shaping probes, no more feelers, no pause to fix exact grids. The mission was now defined by brute imperative: punch a hole or accept the erasure of an American battalion on the Western Front in sight of winter. They moved before first light, massing what was left of 2 understrength battalions under a shell-plastered rise the men would later call Bloody Draw. The German 338th Volksgrenadiers and attached MG teams had interlocked fire across those slopes like latticework. Crossfire low, mortars over, snipers on the timber seam. When the Nice companies lifted off in a crouched walk, they entered a space already registered, bracketed, and waiting. "You felt watched without seeing watchers," one survivor said. Machine gun fans cut channels through the trees, but the line did not fold. Grenade teams leapfrogged tree to tree, using trunks as armor until splinters rained. One platoon charged a nest at 10 yards with bayonet and stun grenades when ammunition ran low. A company runner described stepping on bodies he could not see until his boots slid on web gear. By mid-afternoon, the attack had lost officers, radio links, and most of its margin for failure, but it had not stopped. The diary literature from those hours is raw. A junior officer penciled, "We are cracking the ring with blood, not plan." Another note records a medic saying over a body, "They will live because you died moving." The wisdom that seeps from these fragments is not heroic but cold. In close war, arithmetic is kinetic. The side that spends last still owns the ground. The Germans read the same math. As dusk bled into sleet, SS detachments began to peel off the inner perimeter, redeploying to avoid entrapment. Intercepted fragments hinted they believed the lost battalion might be a lure for a larger American envelopment and chose to preserve combat power rather than harvest the pocket. That sliver, not mercy, not collapse, but a German decision to trade ground for time, opened the seam the 442nd needed. When the corridor cracked open near the hamlet of Biffontaine, the rescuers found them, skeletal, mud-painted Americans of the 141 St, still clutching rifles, eyes sunk and voiceless from shock and dehydration. Some could not stand. Many could not speak. One officer simply wrote later, "Their faces answered every question." In the regimental ledger, the accounting was brutal. To save roughly 200 men, the 442nd had lost multiples of that in killed and wounded in the previous days. Here lies the reveal rarely printed in abbreviated war histories. The rescue cost more than it saved in lives. And yet its strategic consequence, reopening a flank in the Vosges and preventing the political and psychological fallout of a lost U.S. battalion, outweighed the math. Modern readers may recoil at that calculus. Armies live inside it. The hill was taken, the ring broken, the Texans pulled out through a corridor of mud and dead leaves. But the paper victory masked a deeper scar. Dozens of patrols, runners, and small elements never returned and were never traced again with precision. The forest had given up one battalion, and kept others without record. The price was paid, the ledger was not closed. Once the corridor closed behind the withdrawn Texans, the public story of the Vosges stayed simple: rescue accomplished. But paperwork did not match ground truth. Casualty rolls from late October and first week of November arrived in headquarters out of sequence. Platoon rosters carried pencil ghosts, names struck with no coordinates, no witness time of loss. Patrol logs in some companies stopped mid-page, never resumed. Even after the line moved east, the record of who died where in the timber remained perforated. The reasons were not sinister, they were structural. In wooded, no-visibility combat, the act of recovering bodies exposed litter teams to the same fire that killed the first men. Commanders often waited to re-enter ground after the line shifted, but rain, mortars, and the churn of new fighting erased the scene. When a platoon is attacked at arm's length and then dragged by shell bursts off its own trace, the forensic trail ends in mud. The German withdrawal left no paper trove to offset the loss. Their own small unit logs were burning in stoves by December. Families wrote letters for years after the war asking what ravine, what hour, what attempt their son died in. In many cases, no officer from the regiment could answer with more than, "during the drive on Biffontaine." The Army's graves registration units later worked the Vosges, but the forest yielded grudgingly. Some remains surfaced promptly. Others were found in the 1950s when loggers cut back the trunks. Still others never appeared. The silence of that timber outlasted the surrender of Germany. Historians who revisited the files in the 1970s found not negligence but triage. Archival gaps clustered exactly where the fight was most urgent, the point at which commanders had to choose living momentum over dead certainty. A staff colonel wrote on one memorandum, "To press or to perfect the record, only one fits in an hour." That is the bureaucratic sentence form of a battlefield truth. Sometimes you win and misremember simultaneously. For a modern lens, the Vosges is a case study in what secret operations and operational secrecy do to memory after the fact. When a mission is partly unspoken, you are rescuing as much the Army's word as its men. The incentives for clean transparency later are low. The war raced east, the narrative raced with it. Ammunition and replacements, not footnotes, decided survival in November 1944. Meanwhile, the human residue remained. A veteran of the 442nd told an interviewer decades later, "We recovered Texans, but we did not recover all of ours, and there was no page for that." That sentence contains the wound beneath the metal. Victory was real, but the account was incomplete by design and by terrain. And the forest, still uncut in many sectors, held its own veto on closure. By winter, the Vosges campaign had been overtaken in headlines by the drive to the Rhine and the shock of the Ardennes. The national eye moved. The unresolved paper blanks did not. And for families who never saw a grave, the mystery did not expire with VE Day. It merely aged into an unanswered chapter of a war that recorded almost everything, except the men the forest chose not to return. In the decades after the war, the Vosges changed shape but not verdict. What had been sealed timber and blind ravines were cut back by logging roads and pasture lines, and with each disturbance small disclosures surfaced, canteens stamped with service numbers, shattered M1 receivers, dog tags wedged in root systems, even human remains in boots still pointed the way the platoon had been facing when it died. The forest released facts slowly, as if rationing confession. Local farmers learned to call in discoveries without ceremony. Gendarmes and U.S. liaison officers collected them into the slow machinery of identification. Some families, who had received only a telegram reading, "missing, presumed killed," finally got a coffin and a date decades late. Others heard nothing, because nothing turned up. The war had ended. Some stories did not. The 442 ND's Vosges action was later catalogued in a sentence that belies its weight: the most decorated U.S. unit by size and length of service, and the most costly rescue by ratio in the European theater. Ceremonies and documentaries restored the name of the men whom the Army had trusted with the ugliest arithmetic in the woods. But none of those tributes could refill the missing pages of the logbooks or name the patrols that never walked back out of the dark. In strategy schools and staff rides, the fight is now cited not for spectacle but for the structural lesson underneath it. Hard terrain plus secrecy produces permanent blanks. You can decide to commit, or you can decide to document, but under fire you will rarely achieve both. In civilian life the analog endures. Whenever decisions are taken in rush and in opacity, someone later will pay with ambiguity that cannot be undone. And so the Vosges story closes on a paradox that survived the armies that made it. A battalion was saved, a ledger was never repaired. The Republic gained a victory, the forest kept its due. Even now, the most accurate sentence that can be written about those lost days in the timber is the one the veterans already wrote in shorthand: victory recorded, story incomplete.